He joins me now this afternoon for this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on Newsnight this afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me.
So can we safely assume at this moment in time that Ramaphosa ceases to exist, or are we still hopping on the bandwagon of the president almost rescuing South Africans of what would have been a downturn economically, especially during the tenure of President Jacob Zuma?
Well, in my view, Ramaphosa is in the intensive care unit, but there are those who still hope that it can be saved, including President Cyril Ramaphosa himself. In fact, I remember towards the end of last year, The Guardian in the UK spoke about the Ramaphosa period as a period from Ramaphoria to Ramageddon.
Ramageddon?
Yes.
Okay, please expound on that.
Because there was a lot of promise, there was a lot of hope, and Ramaphosa and those around him and those who love him tried to position him in contradistinction to Zuma. So you have a situation where the Zuma period was what I refer to as darkness at noon. It was a period of political darkness. And the new dawn was supposed to be a period of political light, but also social and economic light. It came with lots of promises. And under Ramaphosa, South Africa would become the land of milk, honey, and prosperity. But if you look at what has happened ever since, first of all, he is failing to take charge of his own party.
Allow me to play devil's advocate here for this conversation, but is he really failing, or are we naive to the extent of inherited bad debt, for lack of a better term, or inherited issues that were not spoken about publicly, and things that are started to come out in instituted commissions of inquiry set to actually bring out those issues, that he inherited a bad country, really, a country in financial issues, a country where state-owned enterprises are in complete disarray, and now he has to do something to fix all of this in a short period of time.
Well, that brings me to another thing. The ANC behaves like its factions are franchises. So the Ramaphosa ANC franchise is trying to distance itself from the Jacob Zuma ANC franchise. So they would have us believe that this is not the same ANC.
That the 9 years was a waste of time. Isn't that
well, it was 9 years of ANC rule under Jacob Zuma. And President Cyril Ramaphosa was a silent partner to former President Jacob Zuma. So this attempt to distance Ramaphosa from that 9 years of the ravages of the Zuma presidency is an exercise in fiction, as far as I'm concerned.
So you think that he had the jurisdiction, and obviously he was deputy president then, so it would be very irresponsible of us to assume that there was no leverage of power that he held. But do you think that during the tenure of President Jacob Zuma, all he was doing was trying to keep his job? Because we all saw what happened with the likes of Cebisi Jonas, that as soon as you said anything against the president, or as soon as you refused something, you would immediately be replaced, right? So was he not at that moment in time just trying to be a deputy president, earn a salary, and know that someday things will turn around where he's at the helm?
I think you're making a good point, that faced with a choice between being loyal to the interests of the country and citizens and being loyal to their personal interests, he and others in the ANC, in defending and by defending Jacob Zuma, chose to be loyal to their self-interest.
Sure. And then when it comes to issues around economic stability, do we see this economic stability actually manifesting within, let's give it a 5-year period, because we need to be realistic in terms of where we are as a country economically. The latest statistics came out and said that there's been a slight increase in the number of employment in the country. So that was good news for us. But at the helm, we're dealing with issues of, power outages or load shedding as we know it, and certain economic downturns where the president was, when he first came in, he was instituting a lot of investment tours to try to gather investments and to get the global economy almost investing in South Africa, so to say. So with that said, do we say that the next 5 years should be a period of us actually building and sorting out the big mess that has been caused by officials that are simply corrupt in the country?
Well, before we come to that, let me take one step back. People say those who are critical of Ramaphosa are naive because what they expect him to have achieved in a single year is unrealistic, and that is true. But who created that expectation? It is him by talking about the new dawn in a particular way. So your husband says to you, I will buy you 5 jets, and creates that expectation. He doesn't deliver, and he blames you for it. This is what is happening
So
here.
in other words, what you're saying is that South Africa, at the moment in time, are a bunch of abused people, or emotionally abused people, seeking for a savior, when we knew from the very beginning that Ramaphosa could not save this country, simply because the saving would happen over an extended period of time and the mess was too large.
Well, let me answer that in contradictory terms. It was always unfair and unrealistic to think President Ramaphosa will turn around this mess in a single year. But at the same time, it is not unfair to accuse Ramaphosa and those around him of having planted those expectations in the minds of South Africans. And therefore, to some extent, while you may blame South Africans for being unrealistic in their expectations, those expectations are a product of the hope that South Africa under Ramaphosa will be the antithesis of South Africa under Jacob Zuma. When it comes to the economy, I think what best explains where we are is Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. And that doctrine tells us that when a country is going through a deep crisis, such as a deep economic crisis, it becomes susceptible to the imposition of policy measures from outside. And in South Africa, what it means is that those policy measures are being imposed on the ANC government from outside the ANC, from outside the state, and secondly, from outside South Africa as a country. But you have a president whose logic is not inconsistent with the logic of those whose economic interests are dominant in the global economy and the domestic economy. And therefore, to the extent that President Ramaphosa is an extension of that logic, it's highly unlikely that South Africa's economy will be turned around, because he does not posit what I would call a counter-hegemonic logic, a logic which explains how the ANC government is going to undo the colonial and apartheid structure of the economy. All the ANC under him and before him has been doing is to say the state basically is a referee. The state is not biased towards any class, towards any group of South Africans. It is a referee that mediates amongst all of them. And therefore what we end up with is an ANC and an ANC president who tries to be everything to everyone.
Which is obviously deemed impossible. But then at this stage, does that mean that the African National Congress coming these elections risk at possibly even being at the mercy of a coalition government? In other words, when the statistics came out and the polls came out, I mean, the last time actually it was something about 45% or 42%, etc., in terms of the favorability of a political party such as the African National Congress. So does that mean the possibility of an EFF, DA, an ANC-led coalition, even maybe even the other small ones, is more imminent than what we actually think?
Well, while the ANC is in the middle of a decline, it's a strategic, leadership, moral and other levels, at the same time, the ANC's political crisis is not representative, at least not totally, of the political crisis we face. So the political crisis we face in South Africa is deeper than the crisis in the ANC. We have a generalized political crisis in the country, which means the alternatives to the ANC, as I keep on saying, are hollow and shallow. And to some extent...
Not even with the economic freedom fighters. And the reason why I'm bringing the EFF is because they're the ones that initiated, and even though many would assume that they got it from belonging to ANC structures, they're the ones that are propagating really front row and center all these issues around land, and it appears to be resonating among South Africa. They're the ones that are pushing issues around, you know, when you start addressing the injustices and economic injustices of the past, and how do we do so? So you don't think that they would be, perhaps with these coming elections and the despondencies that has been sort of articulated and even expressed by many South Africans, the South Africans would then sway towards an EFF vote, therefore leveraging more to be influential when it comes to the political decision?
The EFF is not the next government of South Africa. The DA is not the next government of South Africa. In my view, there are only two possibilities: a coalition government
or the ANC.
Or the ANC.
Where are we there? Are we looking towards more coalition, or are we looking towards more of a two-thirds majority as we've experienced with the African National
Well,
Congress?
the shallowness and the hollowness of the alternatives to the ANC means, despite its weaknesses, there is a strong possibility that the ANC will win an absolute or an outright majority in May. What you can quibble about is how small or big that majority will be, which is sad in a way, because I am beginning to gravitate towards the view that South Africa needs a new revolution. And we keep on confusing the revolution in the ANC. The two are not synonymous. To the extent that South Africa needs a new revolution, that revolution must proceed with or without the ANC.
What kind of revolution are you speaking about when South Africa needs a revolution? Because when you say that, it immediately brings me back to the Arab Spring, which is led significantly by young people. And we saw that governments were toppled because people were just simply fed up with the way in which
the Arab Spring is not a good example.
Yeah.
Because it was not a spring. It turned out into an autumn, and now it is winter.
Well, it's a winter, but it started and was effective.
Well, once again, people attached their unrealistic expectations to what was happening in the Middle East. So in the first place, I've never bought into the idea that what was happening there was a spring. So in a way, I'm not the right person to ask about that, because my bias lies elsewhere. And when it comes to South Africa, what you must remember is that the struggle against apartheid was a struggle about the creation of a society that in social, economic, and political terms, and in terms of gender relations, would be the antithesis of apartheid society. But that's not the end in itself. Beyond that, in post-apartheid South Africa, we must fight for, or we must create a society that is qualitatively better, even than this society, which is the antithesis of apartheid society. Now, when I listen to the State of the Nation address, and I'll be listening to the budget speech next week, one of the questions I ask is, to what extent does this speech, the SONA or the budget speech, take us to the goal, or towards the goal, of creating a society that in qualitative terms is an improvement over the kind of society we're fighting for during apartheid? And it seems to me what keeps on happening increasingly is that the gap between words and what they describe, if you look at these speeches, becomes wider. By that I mean this. The word paper is not a paper. And therefore the words radical economic transformation do not constitute radical economic transformation. The struggle is to bridge the gap between the two.
Yeah.
And I think to some extent we see the gap between the words and what they describe widening, whereas the struggle now must be about shortening or bridging the gap between words and what they describe.
Let me ask you this, Koko Aubrey. When it comes to issues around the state and the role of the state, right, because we're talking about a statesman here, number one in the country, so to say, are we becoming a dependent society on the state? In other words, we do not see ourselves as being able to exist outside of the provisions of the state in itself. Hence the dependency on social grants, which I'm not taking away the cause of the poor because of simply where we come from as a country. We don't take away that. But in order for us to find alternatives where we can create a society that can function independently and autonomously, and people that can make self-determination, which is a very important aspect of it, people that can make their own decisions and have free economic will, because of taking away the dependency element of the state, that we'll be able to create it. 70 million people are relying on social grants. I'm not saying remove the social grants. What I'm saying, how do we then best capacitate people so that they can themselves able to purchase bread? Because for the mere fact that we've got a society that relies on government to provide for them to purchase bread, that means that we've got a state that is highly, where the people are highly dependent, and therefore politicians are able to utilize and abuse and exploit and even implant things in people that are unrealistic and create these unrealistic expectations of an abused wife.
Well, if we ask the question, are we too dependent on the state? Are South Africans too dependent on the state? Are the poor too dependent on the state? The question is that a bad thing? For me, that's the more interesting question. Is that a bad thing? Which brings you to another question. Whether you believe people should be dependent on the state or not is whether you believe the people are an entity that is external to the state. So if you agree that the people must govern, the question is through which instrument must they govern? They must govern through the instrument of the state.
The guidance of the state.
A state must have a bias towards their interests. And in this case, I would aver that it should have a bias towards workers. It should have a bias towards those who were oppressed during apartheid. It should have a bias towards the poor. In other words, the state must be both autonomous and embedded. So there's an extent to which the state must be autonomous from the interests of the people, because if it is not, it may try to be everything to everyone. So when it takes a particular bias, it becomes autonomous from certain interests in society. But at the same time, it must be embedded with particular interests in society, the interests of those who are oppressed, workers, the working class, and those who are poor.
Okay, and then when it looks at the people in itself, and the people governing, and the people being able to determine where to from here, where to from May the 8th, right? What is the sentiment from the people's perspective on the ground? Because you and I can sit on this very fancy table of ENCA and really discuss the people's perspective, but ultimately, as much as we are going to go to vote, they're going to vote and determine who they want to lead. And in that way, from the people's perspective, where do you think those interests lie?
Well, we'll only know when the results are tallied. But what I can say is that there's a time when the ANC talks of the people as the key motive force of the revolution. But what they've been doing, especially since the 2009 elections, they've been exercising their sense of agency. So if you look at the results since 2009, the ANC has been trending downwards. So which means those who have been voting ANC have been changing their perspectives and therefore their votes. Actually, if we put it in racial terms, black people, the majority of whom have been supporting the ANC, have showed a preparedness to change when it comes to their political preferences or political party preferences, whereas white people basically have been voting the same way they have been voting since 1948. In other words, they tend to look for a party that represents white interests. And therefore, it seems that it is the black voters who tend to be more pragmatic about the link between their interests and the political party that must be in power. And this is what explains the ANC downward trend in performance since 2009.
Well, Koko Aubrey, thanks a lot for joining us this evening.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
On Newsnight and sharing some very insightful conversation indeed.